The land remembers. The high desert held its breath that morning, not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of something waiting. The sky stretched pale and endless, the color of old linen left too long in the sun. To the east, the mountains were a smudge of gray against gray. No birds called. The sagebrush stood motionless, as if the wind itself had given up and gone elsewhere. She had been walking since before dawn. Not from anywhere in particular, not toward anywhere that mattered, just away. That was enough. Her name was Abigail Kern, though she had not heard it spoken aloud in 6 months. She was not young, not old, somewhere in the middle, where a woman becomes invisible unless she is useful. Her dress was the color of dust, her boots worn thin at the heels. She carried a canvas satchel across one shoulder, and a canteen that sloshed with the last of yesterday's water. Her hands were chapped and scarred, hands that had worked, hands that had buried things. She did not look back. There was nothing behind her but a burnt cabin and a grave she had dug herself. The grave was small, too small. She had lined it with stones because the ground was hard and the coyotes were persistent. She had spoken no words over it. Words had seemed like a luxury she could not afford. The town appeared in the distance just after midday. It was not much of a town, a scatter of wooden buildings huddled together as if afraid of the open land around them. A church with a crooked steeple, a general store, a saloon with a painted sign so faded she could not read it from the road. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, thin and reluctant. Abigail had not meant to stop. She had been following the road only because it was easier than walking through the scrub. But her feet hurt, and the canteen was empty, and the sun was high and merciless. She told herself she would fill the canteen and leave. Nothing more. The road into town was rutted and dry. Her boots raised little clouds of dust with each step. A dog lay in the shade of a porch, too hot to bark. A man in a leather apron stood in the doorway of the smithy, watching her. She did not meet his eyes. The well was in the center of town, a stone circle with a wooden bucket on a rope. She drew water slowly, careful not to spill. The water was cold and tasted of minerals. She drank deeply, then filled the canteen. As she straightened, she felt eyes on her. Not one pair. Many. A group of men stood near the saloon, watching. A woman in a faded bonnet peered from a window. 2 children stopped their game in the dirt to stare. Abigail felt the weight of their attention like a hand on her shoulder. She had learned in recent months that a woman alone drew suspicion. A woman alone was either running from something or looking for something. Either way, she was trouble. She turned to leave. That was when she saw the cage. It stood in the square, near the church. An iron box, barely tall enough for a man to stand, barely wide enough for a man to turn. The bars were thick and rust-streaked. Inside, a figure sat hunched, knees drawn up, head bowed. A man. His shirt was torn. His hair hung loose and dark around his face. His hands rested on his knees, still and patient. Abigail stopped. She should not have stopped. She should have walked past, filled her canteen, and kept moving. But something in the stillness of the man held her. He did not rattle the bars. He did not call out. He simply sat, as if waiting had become a kind of prayer. A voice spoke behind her. "He don't talk." She turned. The man from the smithy had followed her. He was broad-shouldered, his face red from the heat of the forge. He wiped his hands on his apron and nodded toward the cage. "Been there 3 days," the man said. "Sheriff caught him up near the pass, accused of stealing horses. Maybe worse. Hard to say. He won't speak a word." Abigail looked back at the cage. The man inside had not moved. His face was hidden by his hair, but she could see the line of his shoulders, tense and still. "Why is he in a cage?" she asked. Her voice felt strange in her throat. She had not spoken to anyone in weeks. The smithy shrugged. "Jail's full, and folks want to see him. Make sure he don't run." "What will they do with him?" "Hang him, most like, soon as the judge comes through." Abigail felt something tighten in her chest. She did not know this man. She had no reason to care. But the cage reminded her of something. A trap. A box. A place where things were left to die slowly, in full view, so that others could feel safe. She turned away. The smithy was still watching her. You passing through? He asked. Yes. Where you headed? Away. He nodded slowly, as if that were answer enough. Then he turned and walked back toward the forge, his boots heavy in the dust. Abigail stood in the square, the canteen cold in her hand. The sun beat down. The man in the cage did not move. The town watched. She felt the pull of the road, the long, empty miles ahead. She felt the exhaustion in her bones, the ache of walking, the weight of carrying nothing and everything at once. She should leave. She should go. But she did not. Instead, she walked toward the general store. The door creaked when she pushed it open. Inside, it was dim and cool. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with cans and sacks and coils of rope. An old man sat behind the counter, his spectacles perched on his nose. "Help you?" he asked. Abigail hesitated. Then she said, "I need a loaf of bread and some dried meat." The old man raised an eyebrow. "You got money?" She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small cloth pouch. Inside were 3 coins, all she had left. She placed 2 on the counter. The old man took them without comment. He wrapped the bread and meat in brown paper and handed them to her. Abigail took the package. She felt the weight of it. Then she walked back outside, into the light and the heat and the eyes of the town. She walked toward the cage. The man inside did not look up. She knelt and placed the package on the ground, just outside the bars. Then she stood and walked away, her heart beating hard. Her hands empty. The encounter. The sun climbed higher, and the town seemed to shrink beneath it. Abigail sat on the steps of the church, in the thin wedge of shade offered by the overhang. She had told herself she would rest only a moment, then move on. But the moment stretched. Her feet throbbed. Her throat was dry again, though she had just drunk her fill. She watched the cage from the corner of her eye. The man inside had not touched the food. The package lay where she had left it, brown paper bright against the dust. She wondered if he had even seen it. His head remained bowed, his hands still on his knees. From a distance, he looked like a statue, something carved and left to weather. A group of boys drifted into the square, kicking a leather ball between them. They were loud, their voices sharp with the cruelty that comes easy to children. One of them, a boy with red hair and a torn shirt, saw the cage and grinned. He said something to the others. They laughed. Then they moved closer. Abigail watched. She should not have cared. It was not her business. But her hands tightened on the edge of the step. The red-haired boy picked up a stone. He weighed it in his palm, then threw it. It clanged against the bars, loud as a bell. The man inside did not flinch. The boys laughed again. Another stone followed. Then another. The man did not move. He sat with his head bowed, as if the stones were rain, and he had long since stopped noticing weather. One of the stones struck his shoulder. Still, he did not react. The boys grew bolder. They moved closer to the cage, calling out taunts. Their voices blurred together, meaningless and sharp. Abigail could not make out the words, but the tone was enough. It was the sound as people who needed someone smaller to kick. She stood. Her legs were unsteady, but she walked toward them. The boys did not notice her at first. They were too focused on their game. She stopped a few feet away and spoke. "That's enough." Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise. The boys turned. The red-haired one looked her up and down, his grin fading into something harder. "Who are you?" he asked. "Nobody," Abigail said, "and you're done." The boy laughed, but it was a thin sound. He glanced at his friends, then back at her. "We're just having fun. Find another game." For a moment, she thought he would argue. His hand tightened around the stone he still held. But something in her face must have warned him. Or perhaps he simply grew bored. He dropped the stone and shrugged. "Come on," he said to the others. They followed him, their laughter trailing behind them like smoke. Abigail stood alone in the square. The man in the cage had not moved. She knelt and picked up the package of food. The paper was dusty, but intact. She moved closer to the bars and set it down again, this time within reach. "You should eat," she said. The man did not respond. She had not expected him to. The sniffy had said he did not speak. She studied him for a moment. His hands were broad and scarred, the knuckles thick. His wrists bore raw marks where rope or iron had rubbed the skin away. He was not old, perhaps 30, perhaps less. It was hard to tell beneath the grime and exhaustion. She straightened and turned to go. But as she stepped away, she heard a sound, a faint rustling. She glanced back. The man had lifted his head, just slightly. His hair fell away from his face, and she saw his eyes for the first time. They were dark, not angry, not pleading, just watching, as if he were trying to decide whether she was real. She held his gaze for a moment, then she nodded once and walked away. By evening, the town had emptied into the saloon. Abigail could hear the noise from where she sat on the church steps. Laughter, the clink of glasses, a piano playing badly. She had spent the afternoon walking the edge of town, weighing her options. She had no money left, no destination. The road stretched in every direction, and all of it looked the same. She could keep walking. She had done it before. But the thought filled her with a weariness so deep it felt like drowning. She had been walking for months, away from the cabin, away from the grave, away from the memory of a small hand going still in hers. She had thought that if she walked far enough, the weight would lift. But it had not. It had only changed shape. The sound of boots on wood pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up. A man stood at the edge of the square, silhouetted against the fading light. He was tall, his coat dark, a star pinned to his chest. The sheriff. He walked toward the cage, his steps slow and deliberate. He carried a tin plate in one hand. Abigail watched as he stalked at the cage and set the plate on the ground. He said something she could not hear. The man inside did not respond. The sheriff waited a moment, then turned and walked back toward the saloon. He did not look at Abigail as he passed. When he was gone, she stood and crossed the square. The man in the cage had not touched the sheriff's plate either. It sat beside the package she had left, both untouched. She knelt and looked through the bars. "You'll die if you don't eat," she said. The man lifted his head again. This time, his eyes met hers directly. There was something in them she recognized. Not defiance, not surrender, something else. A kind of patience that came from knowing the world would do what it would do, and words would not change it. He reached out slowly, his movements careful, and picked up the package she had left. He unwrapped it with stiff fingers. The bread was hard, the meat dry. He broke off a piece of bread and ate it without expression. Then he tore a strip of meat and chewed it slowly, as if each bite required thought. Abigail watched. She did not know why she stayed. She should have left him to his silence. But something in the act of eating, the simple animal need of it, held her. When he was done, he folded the paper carefully and set it aside. Then he looked at her again. "Thank you," he said. His voice was rough, as if unused. The words were quiet, but they landed between them like stones in still water. Abigail blinked. The smithy had said he did not speak, but here were words, small and deliberate. She nodded. "You're welcome." He lowered his head again, and the silence returned. But it was different now, not empty, full of something unsaid. Abigail stood and walked back to the church steps. The sky had deepened to purple. Stars were beginning to appear, small and cold. She wrapped her arms around herself and watched the cage. The man inside did not move, but she knew he was still awake, still waiting, and for reasons she could not name, she decided she would wait too. The unspoken pact. The night came down cold. Abigail had forgotten how cold the desert could be once the sun left. She sat on the church steps with her arms wrapped tight around her knees, her breath rising in pale clouds. The town had gone quiet. The saloon had emptied an hour past, men stumbling home or sleeping where they fell. A single lamp burned in a window across the square, then went dark. She should find shelter. The church door was probably unlocked. Most were. But she did not move. Her eyes stayed on the cage. The man inside sat as he had all day, motionless in the dark. She wondered if he was cold. She wondered if he slept. She wondered why she cared. A sound broke the silence. Footsteps, uneven and slow. She turned her head. A figure emerged from the shadows near the general store. The old man who ran it. He carried a lantern in one hand and a folded blanket in the other. He walked to the cage and set the lantern down. The light flickered across the bars. "Cold night," the old man said. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. He pushed the blanket through the bars. "This ain't much, but it's something." The man inside looked up. He took the blanket without a word and pulled it around his shoulders. The old man nodded, picked up his lantern, and walked away. He did not look at Abigail as he passed, but she thought she saw something in his face. Not kindness exactly, just wariness, the kind that came from watching. Going too much and being able to do too little. When he was gone, Abigail stood. Her body ached from sitting, from walking, from the weight of months spent carrying grief like a stone. She crossed the square slowly. The man in the cage watched her approach. His face was half hidden in shadow, but his eyes caught the starlight. She stopped at the bars. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she lowered herself to the ground and sat with her back against the wooden post that anchored the cage. The iron was cold through her dress. She pulled her shawl tighter and closed her eyes. "You should go inside," the man said. His voice was quiet, barely more than a whisper. "So should you," Abigail said. A pause. Then, so faint she almost missed it, a sound that might have been a laugh. Not a happy sound. Just recognition of the absurdity. She opened her eyes and looked up at the stars. They were bright and cold and indifferent. "What's your name?" she asked. Silence. She thought he would not answer. Then, "Caleb." "Abigail." Another silence, comfortable this time. She listened to the wind moving through the sagebrush beyond the town. It sounded like water, like something alive and restless. "Did you steal the horses?" she asked. No. She believed him. She did not know why. Perhaps because a man who would not speak to save himself seemed unlikely to lie when he finally did. Perhaps because she had stopped trusting the loudest voices long ago. "Will they listen if you tell them?" No. She nodded. That too made sense. She had learned that the truth mattered less than the story people wanted to believe. And a silent man in a cage made for an easy story. The night deepened. The cold settled into her bones. She should move. She should find warmth. But the act of sitting, of sharing the silence with someone who did not demand anything from it, felt like the first rest she had known in months. So she stayed. At some point, she dozed. Not deeply. Just enough to lose the thread of time. When she woke, the stars had shifted. Her neck was stiff, her legs numb. She heard a sound and turned her head. Caleb had moved closer to the bars. He had taken the blanket from his shoulders and pushed part of it through the gap. It lay across her lap now, rough wool still holding a trace of warmth. She looked up at him. He had turned his face away, as if the gesture embarrassed him. She pulled the blanket around herself and felt something in her chest crack open, just a little. Not much, but enough to let in a sliver of something she had thought she lost. Not hope. Smaller than that. Just the memory of what it felt like to be seen. "Thank you," she whispered. He did not answer. But his hand rested on the bars, close to where she sat. Not reaching, just present. The dawn came slowly, the sky turning from black to gray to pale gold. Abigail woke fully as the light touched her face. She sat up, stiff and aching, and folded the blanket. Caleb was asleep, his head resting against the bars, his breathing slow and even. She stood carefully, so as not to wake him, and draped the blanket back through the bars. It settled over his shoulders like a benediction. The town began to stir. Smoke rose from chimneys. A rooster crowed. Abigail walked to the well and drew water, washing her face and hands in the cold shock of it. She felt lightheaded from hunger, but ignored it. She had been hungry before. It was nothing new. She returned to the cage as Caleb woke. He blinked against the light, then saw her and sat up straighter. She knelt and spoke through the bars. "When does the judge come?" "Don't know. Could be days, could be weeks. And until then, I wait." She looked at him, at the raw skin on his wrists, at the exhaustion carved into his face, at the stillness that was not peace, but endurance. "I'll bring you water," she said. He shook his head. "You don't have to." "I know." She stood and walked to the well. She filled her canteen and brought it back. He drank deeply, his hands shaking slightly as he held it. When he was done, he handed it back through the bars. Their fingers brushed, just for a moment. But the touch was warm and real, and it startled them both. The day unfolded slowly. Abigail stayed near the square, sitting in the shade, watching the town move around them. People passed. Some stared. Some ignored them both. A woman in a blue dress stopped and whispered something to her companion, their eyes cutting toward Abigail with suspicion. She did not care. She had stopped caring what strangers thought long ago. At midday, she returned to the general store. The old man looked up enchanted. "You still here?" he said. Not a question. "I need work," Abigail said. "Anything. I can clean, mend, cook." The old Nan studied her. Then he nodded toward the back room. "Storeroom needs sorting. pays a meal, and a place to sleep. One night. That's enough. She worked through the afternoon, organizing sacks of flour and beans, sweeping dust, mending a torn feed bag with needle and thread the old man provided. Her hands remembered the motions. She had done this kind of work before. It was simple, honest. It asked nothing of her but effort. When she finished, the old man gave her a plate of stew and a hunk of bread. She ate half and wrapped the rest in cloth. Then she carried it to the cage. Caleb took it without a word, but his eyes said everything. She sat with her back to the post as he ate. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and orange. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. She thought about it. Then she said, "Because no one should die alone in a box." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "You speak like you know." She did not answer, but her hand moved to the pocket of her dress, where a small ring rested, too small for her finger, meant for a child who would never grow into it. She closed her hand around it and said nothing. The night returned, and once again they shared the silence and the cold, the echo of the past. The third morning came with wind. It rattled the loose boards of the buildings and sent dust devils spinning through the square. Abigail woke on the floor of the storeroom, her body curled on a pile of empty feed sacks. The old man had kept his word. It was not much, but it was shelter. She rose stiffly and stepped outside. Caleb was awake, standing now, his hands gripping the bars. He looked thinner than he had 2 days before. The hollows under his eyes had deepened, but he was still upright, still present. When he saw her, something in his posture eased. She brought him water first. And the remainder of last night's bread. He ate slowly, as if rationing each bite against an uncertain future. She sat on the ground near the cage and watched the town wake. A wagon rolled past, the driver flicking his eyes toward them but saying nothing. A woman hung laundry on a line, the wet cloth snapping in the wind. "Tell me something," Caleb said. Abigail looked up. "What?" "Anything. I've been silent so long, I forget what voices sound like." She considered. Then she said, "I had a daughter." The words came out flat, simple, as if she were reporting the weather. But her hands tightened in her lap. Caleb did not speak. He waited. The wind filled the silence between them. "She was 4, Abigail continued. Her voice was quiet, each word pulled from some deep place she had tried to seal shut. "Fever took her in the spring. My husband had died the winter before, fell through ice on the river. I buried them both behind the cabin. Then I burned the cabin and walked away." She stopped. Her throat felt tight. She had not said these words aloud before. They had lived inside her like a sickness, growing and rotting. Saying them now did not make them lighter, but it made them real in a different way. Witnessed. Caleb's hand appeared through the bars, palm up, an offering. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed gently around hers. They were rough and warm. They did not pull. They just held. "I'm sorry," he said. She nodded. That was all. There was nothing else to say. Sorry did not bring anyone back, but it mattered that he said it. It mattered that he did not tell her it was God's will, or that time would heal, or any of the other empty things people said when they did not know what else to do. They sat like that, hands joined through the bars, until the wind shifted and she pulled away. She wiped her eyes quickly. Angry at the tears. She had promised herself she would not cry anymore. Crying was indulgent. It changed nothing. "What about you?" she asked. Her voice was steadier now. "Why won't you defend yourself?" Caleb leaned back against the bars. His face was unreadable. For a moment, she thought he would retreat into silence again. But then he spoke. "I was a scout. For the army. Years back, before the territory settled. I knew the land, knew the people who lived on it before we came. I tried to walk both sides. Tried to keep the peace." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I failed." He reached into his shirt and pulled out something small. A leather cord around his neck. Threaded on it was a single bead, carved from bone, and a small lock of black hair tied with red thread. He held it up so she could see. "Her name was Ayana," he said. "She was Nede. Apache, the settlers called them. I lived with her people for 2 years, learned their language, their ways. She taught me how to track, how to read the sky, how to be still." His voice soft. "Tened, we were going to leave, go north, away from the fighting, but the army came first." He closed his hand around the bead and the lock of hair. His knuckles went white. "They burned the village. I tried to stop it. I tried to speak for them. But I was just one voice, and the soldiers had orders. They killed everyone. Women, children, elders. Ayanna was carrying our child. Abigail felt something cold settle in her chest. She understood now. The silence. The stillness. The way he sat in the cage as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. "You stopped speaking," she said. "What was there to say? My words didn't save them. My words didn't matter, so I stopped using them." He looked at her through the bars. Until now. The wind picked up again, and with it came the smell of rain. Rare in this country. The sky had darkened without her noticing, clouds rolling in from the west. She stood and looked up. The first drops began to fall, cold and sharp. "Come on," she said. She moved closer to the cage, pulling her shawl over her head. The rain fell harder, turning the dust to mud. Caleb pressed himself against the far side of the cage, but there was no shelter. The water poured through the bars, soaking him in moments. Abigail looked around. The square was empty. Everyone had gone inside. She ran to the church and tried the door. Locked. She ran to the general store. Also locked. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and she could barely see. She returned to the cage, her dress heavy and clinging. "Here," she said. She took off her shawl and pushed it through the bars. "It's not much." He took it and draped it over his head and shoulders. It was already soaked, but it was something. She sat down beside the cage, her back against the post, letting the rain hammer down on her. It was cold and brutal and somehow cleansing, as if the sky were washing away the dust of their confessions. Caleb shifted and pressed his back against the bars, close to where she sat. She could feel the warmth of him through the iron. They did not speak. The rain spoke for them. It fell, and the world narrowed to just the two of them, huddled together in the storm. When the rain finally stopped, the sun broke through the clouds in long golden shafts. Steam rose from the ground. Abigail was shivering, her teeth chattering. Caleb handed the shawl back through the bars. "Keep it," she said. "You need it more. You'll freeze." "I'll be fine." He hesitated, then draped it around her shoulders from behind, his hands careful. She pulled it close and felt the warmth of his hands linger in the fabric. She turned her head slightly, and their eyes met. There was something in his face she had not seen before. Not hope, but something close. A crack in the armor of his resignation. "Thank you," he said, "for listening." "Thank you," she replied, "for speaking." The old man from the general store appeared, carrying a broom. He swept water from his doorway and glanced at them. He shook his head, whether in disapproval or pity, she could not tell. Then he went back inside. Abigail stood, her legs unsteady. She wrung water from her dress and looked down at Caleb. He was soaked through, his hair plastered to his face, but his eyes were clear, clearer than they had been. "I'll get you something dry," she said. "You don't have to." "I know." She walked toward the store, her boots squelching in the mud. Behind her, Caleb watched until she disappeared inside. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, words still mattered after all. The test of fire, the fourth day, brought trouble on horseback. 3 men rode into town just after noon, their horses lathered and mean-looking. They wore dusters caked with trail dust, their hats pulled low. The leader was a thick man with a gray beard and eyes like flint. He dismounted in front of the saloon and scanned the square. His gaze landed on the cage, then on Abigail, who sat nearby mending a torn sleeve. She felt the shift in the air before she understood it, the way birds go quiet before a storm. The men tied their horses and walked toward the cage. Their boots struck the ground with purpose. Abigail set down her sewing and stood. The bearded man stopped a few feet from the bars. He looked Caleb up and down, his mouth twisting into something between a smile and a sneer. "Well," he said. "Heard they caught the horse thief. Didn't expect him to still be breathing." Caleb did not respond. He sat with his back against the bars, his face empty of expression. But Abigail saw his hands tighten slightly, saw the tension gather in his shoulders. One of the other men, younger, with a scar running down his cheek, spat into the dirt. "That's him. Thaw. It's the bastard who took my brother's horses. 3 good mares, worth more than his life." "You sure?" the bearded man asked. "Sure enough. He was seen near the canyon 2 weeks back. Same time the horses went missing." The bearded man nodded slowly. He turned to look at the saloon, then back at the cage. "Where's the sheriff?" "Rode out yesterday," a voice called. Abigail turned. The smithy stood in his doorway, arms crossed. Won't be back till tomorrow, maybe longer. The bearded man smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. Well, that's unfortunate. Guess we'll have to handle this ourselves. Abigail stepped forward. She did not plan it. Her body simply moved. He hasn't been tried. The three men turned to look at her. The bearded man's eyes narrowed. And who are you? Nobody, but the law says he gets a trial. The scarred man laughed. It was a sharp, ugly sound. Law also says a man can protect his property. That man stole horses. That's a hanging offense. You don't know he stole them. I know enough. The bearded man held up a hand, silencing his companion. He studied Abigail for a long moment. You his woman? No. Then why do you care? She did not have an answer that would satisfy him, so she said nothing. The bearded man shook his head and turned back to the cage. He pulled a key from his pocket. Abigail's heart kicked hard against her ribs. Where did you get that? She asked. Borrowed it. From a friend. He fitted the key into the lock. The mechanism turned with a rusty click. The door swung open. Come on out, the bearded man said to Caleb. Nice and slow. Caleb did not move. He sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance. The bearded man's patience thinned. He gestured to the scarred man, who stepped forward and grabbed Caleb by the arm, dragging him out of the cage. Caleb did not resist. He let himself be pulled upright, though his legs were unsteady from days of confinement. There's a tree at the edge of town, the bearded man said. Nice and sturdy. We'll make this quick. Abigail's mind raced. She looked around the square. A few faces appeared in windows, watching. But no one moved. No one spoke. The town had decided this was not their problem. Or perhaps they agreed. Either way, they would let it happen. She stepped between Caleb and the men. Her hands were shaking, but she kept her voice steady. You can't do this. The bearded man sighed. Lady, step aside. No, we don't want to hurt you, but we will if we have to. Then you'll have to. For a moment, no one moved. The scarred man looked at his leader, uncertain. The third man, who had been silent until now, shifted his weight and rested his hand on the gun at his hip. Abigail saw it. She did not move. Behind her, Caleb spoke. His voice was low, but it carried. Let her go. This is between you and me. Shut up, the bearded man said. But his eyes stayed on Abigail. She could see him calculating, weighing the cost of dragging her out of the way, weighing how much attention it would draw. She held his gaze and did not blink. A door opened. The old man from the general store stepped out. He held a rifle, not aimed, just resting in the crook of his arm. He did not say anything. He just stood there, watching. A moment later, the smithy appeared, carrying a hammer. Still no words, just presence. The bearded man looked from them to Abigail. His jaw worked. Then he spat into the dirt. This isn't over, he said. He shoved Caleb back toward the cage. The scarred man locked the door and pocketed the key. The three men mounted their horses and rode out of town, their departure loud and deliberate. Abigail's legs gave out. She sat down hard in the dirt, her breath coming in short gasps. The old man walked over and looked down at her. That was foolish, he said. I know. He nodded. Then he turned and went back inside. The smithy lingered a moment longer, his eyes on Caleb. Then he, too, walked away. Abigail stayed on the ground, her hands pressed into the dirt. She felt Caleb move closer to the bars. She looked up. His face was pale, his eyes wide. You could have died, he said. So could you. I'm already dead, it's just taking a long time. She shook her head. No, you're not. He stared at her. Then slowly, he sank down inside the cage until they were at eye level. Why did you do that? She thought about it. About the daughter she had lost. About the husband who had drowned. About all the times she had stood by and watched the world take things from her without fighting back. About how she had walked away from the cabin because staying hurt too much, but walking hurt just as badly. Because I'm tired of watching people disappear, she said. Caleb's hand came through the bars. She took it. They sat like that as the sun moved across the sky and the town pretended nothing had happened. But something had shifted, not just between them, inside her. For the first time since she had started walking, she felt like she was moving towards something instead of away. Night came. The stars appeared cold and distant. Abigail stayed by the cage. She had nowhere else to go. Caleb was quiet, but his presence was a comfort. She wrapped herself in her shawl and leaned against the post. They'll come back, Caleb said. I know. You should leave before they do. I'm not leaving. Abigail, I'm not leaving. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, I don't deserve this. Neither did I. But here we are. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage and distant rain. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called. Abigail closed her eyes and listened. She thought about the men on horseback, about the tree at the edge of town, about the choice she had made to stand between Caleb and the rope. It had not been a plan. It had not been brave. It had simply been the only thing she could do. When the sheriff comes back, she said, we'll tell him what happened. Make him see reason. He won't listen. Then we'll make him. Caleb let out a breath that might have been a laugh. You're stubborn. So I've been told. They fell silent again. The night deepened. And somewhere beyond the edge of town, the three men made camp and waited for their chance. The quiet aftermath. The sheriff returned at dawn. His horse was mud-spattered and weary, and the man himself looked like he had aged a year in the 2 days he had been gone. He dismounted slowly, his hand pressing against his lower back, and surveyed the square. His eyes found the cage first, then Abigail, who sat wrapped in her shawl with her head resting against the post. She had not slept. The sheriff walked over, his boots heavy on the packed earth. He looked down at her, then at Caleb through the bars. Heard there was trouble yesterday. Abigail stood, her legs stiff and aching. 3 men tried to hang him. The sheriff's jaw tightened. Who? I don't know their names. One had a gray beard. Another had a scar on his face. They said he stole horses. The sheriff removed his hat and ran a hand through his thinning hair. The Garrett brothers. I told them to wait for the judge, told them twice. He looked at Caleb. You say anything to them? Caleb shook his head. And you? The sheriff turned back to Abigail. You stopped them? I stood in the way. The storekeeper and the smithy came out. That was enough. The sheriff put his hat back on. He looked tired, not just physically. The kind of tired that came from knowing the law was a thin line drawn in dust, easily blown away. They'll come back, he said, and next time. I might not be here to stop them. Then don't leave, Abigail said. The sheriff studied her. You got a stake in this? I'm here, aren't I? He grunted. It was not quite agreement, but it was not refusal either. He turned and walked toward his office, a small building at the far end of the square. Abigail watched him go, then looked at Caleb. His face was drawn. The lines around his eyes deeper than they had been the day before. You need water, she said. She filled her canteen at the well and brought it to him. He drank slowly, his hands trembling slightly. When he handed it back, their fingers touched. She felt the roughness of his skin, the warmth beneath the cold. I need to clean those, she said, nodding toward his wrists. The raw skin where the iron had rubbed was red and weeping. If it was not tended, it would fester. It's fine, Caleb said. It's not. She went to the general store. The old man was sweeping the floor. The same motion he performed every morning, as if the dust would one day give up and stop returning. He looked up when she entered. I need cloth, Abigail said, and salve, if you have it. The old man set down his broom and moved behind the counter. He pulled out a tin of ointment and a strip of clean linen. He wrapped them in paper and handed them to her. How much? She asked. Nothing. She blinked. I can work. I said nothing. He turned back to his sweeping, dismissing her. She took the package and left. Back at the cage, she knelt and reached through the bars. Give me your hand. Caleb hesitated, then extended his arm. She unwrapped the paper and opened the tin. The salve smelled of pine and something bitter. She dipped her fingers into it and began to spread it gently over the torn skin. He flinched, but did not pull away. This will help, she said. You don't have to do this. I know. She worked in silence, her touch careful. The wounds were worse up close. Days of sitting in iron had left his wrists raw and swollen. She wrapped them with the linen, tying the ends so they would not slip. When she finished, she looked up and found him watching her. Why? He asked. His voice was soft, almost fragile. Because I can, she said. Because no one else will. Because it's the right thing to do. He looked away, his throat working. I stopped believing in right things a long time ago. Maybe it's time to start again. She stood and brushed the dust from her skirt. The sun was higher now, the day warming. The town was stirring, people moving about their business as if yesterday had not happened, as if a man had not nearly been dragged from a cage and hanged without trial. She wondered how they lived with it, or perhaps they did not think about it at all. Perhaps that was the only way to survive in a place like this. The sheriff emerged from his office, carrying a plate of food. He brought it to the cage and set it on the ground, beans and cornbread. Simple, but more than Caleb had been given before. The sheriff glanced at Abigail, then at Caleb's bandaged wrists. "Judge will be here in 3 days," the sheriff said. "Maybe 4. You keep quiet and stay alive till then, and you'll get your say." Caleb nodded. The sheriff walked away without another word. Abigail watched him go, then looked at Caleb. 3 days, she said. 3 days. It felt like a lifetime. It felt like nothing at all. The day passed slowly. Abigail stayed near the square, sitting in the shade, watching the town. She saw the scarred man ride through once, his eyes scanning until they found the cage. He did not stop, but the look he gave was enough. A promise. She forced herself not to look away. When evening came, she brought Caleb more water and the remains of the biscuit the old man had given her. He ate without speaking, his movements slow and deliberate. She sat with her back to the post, and they watched the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Tell me something good," Caleb said. Abigail turned her head. "What?" "Something good. Something that doesn't hurt to remember." She thought for a long time. The memories that came easiest were the ones edged in pain. But she reached past them, searching. Finally she said, "My daughter loved thunderstorms." Most children were afraid, but not her. She would stand at the window and press her hands against the glass, laughing every time the lightning flashed. She said it was the sky clapping. Caleb smiled. It was a small, sad smile, but it was real. "She sounds brave." She was, like her mother. Abigail shook her head. "I'm not brave. I'm just too tired to keep running." Sometimes they're the same thing. They fell into silence. The stars began to appear, one by one, until the sky was full of them. Abigail pulled her shawl tighter and closed her eyes. She felt the exhaustion in her bones, the weight of days without real rest. But beneath it, something else. A small flicker of warmth. Not hope, exactly, but the memory of it. Caleb's voice broke the quiet. "Abigail?" "Yes? If I don't make it, you will." "If I don't," he continued, his voice firm, "I want you to take this." He reached through the bars and held out the leather cord with the bone bead and lock of hair. "It's all I have, but it's hers, and it matters." Abigail looked at the cord, then at him. "I'm not taking it." "Please." "No, because you're going to live and you're going to keep it, and you're going to tell me more about her, about Ayanna, about the life you had." His hand trembled. Then, slowly, he pulled the cord back and slipped it around his neck. "All right," he said. His voice was thick. "All right." Abigail reached through the bars and took his hand. She held it tightly, her fingers interlaced with his. They stayed like that as the night deepened and the town slept. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt alone. The choice to stay or leave. The judge arrived on the morning of the 5th day. He came in a black carriage, pulled by 2 gray horses, dust rising in clouds behind him. The town gathered in the square. A rare excitement rippling through the usual stillness. Abigail stood near the cage, her arms crossed, her eyes on the carriage as it rolled to a stop in front of the sheriff's office. The judge was an old man, thin as a reed, with wire spectacles perched on a sharp nose. He wore a black suit that had seen better days and carried a leather satchel thick with papers. He climbed down from the carriage with the help of the driver and looked around the square. His gaze settled on the cage, then on Caleb inside it. "That the accused?" he asked the sheriff, who had emerged from his office. "Yes, sir." The judge nodded. "Let's get this done. I have 2 more towns to visit before the week's out." They held the trial in the saloon. It was the only building large enough to hold the crowd that had gathered. Abigail pushed her way inside and stood at the back, her heart hammering. Caleb was brought in by the sheriff, his hands bound in front of him. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning the room until they found hers. Something passed between them. Not words, just recognition. The judge sat at a table near the bar, his satchel open in front of him. The scarred man and his 2 companions stood to one side, their hats in their hands, their faces grim. The bearded man stepped forward when the judge called for the accuser. "State your claim," the judge said. "This man stole 3 horses from my brother's ranch 2 weeks past," the bearded man said. "Good mares, worth $100 each. We tracked him to the canyon, saw him with our own eyes." The judge looked at Caleb. "You have anything to say to that?" Caleb stood silent. Abigail's breath caught. She willed him to speak, to defend himself. But he remained still, his face empty. The judge sighed. "Son, if you don't speak, I can't help you." Still, Caleb said nothing. The crowd murmured. Abigail saw the way they looked at him. Guilty, already decided. She pushed forward, her voice cutting through the noise. "He's not a thief." The judge looked up, his spectacles glinting. "And who are you?" "A witness." "To what?" "To his character. I've spent 5 days with him. He's not a thief. He's not violent. He's just a man who's been through more than most." The bearded man laughed. "She's soft on him, been sitting by that cage like a faithful dog. Her word means nothing." Abigail's hands tightened into fists. "My word means as much as yours. More maybe, because I have no reason to lie." The judge held up a hand. "Enough." He looked at Caleb again. "Do you have an alibi? Anyone who can say where you were when these horses were taken?" Caleb's jaw worked. Then finally, he spoke. "No." The single word landed like a stone. The judge leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. "Then I have no choice. The evidence, thin as it is, points to you. And your silence doesn't help." He paused, then said, "I sentence you to 10 years labor. You'll be sent east to the rail camps. If you survive that, you'll be a free man." 10 years. Abigail felt the air leave her lungs. 10 years might as well be a lifetime. Caleb's face did not change. He simply nodded, as if he had expected nothing less. "Wait," Abigail said. Her voice was loud, desperate. "Please, just wait." The judge looked at her with something like pity. "Ma'am, the law is the law. I've made my decision." "Then let me speak for him. Let me tell you who he is." The judge hesitated, and he gestured for her to continue. Abigail stepped forward, her legs shaking. She looked at Caleb, then at the judge. "His name is Caleb. He was a scout. He lived with the Apache for 2 years. He tried to keep the peace, but the Army came and burned the village. They killed the woman he loved and the child she carried. He stopped speaking because his words didn't save them. But he's not a thief. He's not a criminal. He's just a man who lost everything and didn't know how to keep going." The room was silent. The judge studied her, then looked at Caleb. "Is this true?" Caleb's throat worked. Then he nodded. "Yes." The judge removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a handkerchief. He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "The law doesn't care about grief. It cares about evidence. And I don't have enough to hang him, but I have enough to send him away." He looked at the bearded man. "You got proof he took those horses? Something more than just seeing him near the canyon?" The bearded man shifted. "We know it was him. That's not proof. That's suspicion." The judge put his spectacles back on. "I'll reduce the sentence. 5 years. And if someone in this town will vouch for him, I'll suspend it. He'll work off his debt here, under supervision." Abigail's heart leapt. "I'll vouch for him." The judge raised an eyebrow. "You got property? A way to keep him employed?" She hesitated. She had nothing. No land, no money, no home. But before she could answer, the old man from the general store stepped forward. "I'll vouch for him," the old man said. "He can work for me. I need help with the storeroom, loading wagons. I'll keep an eye on him." The judge looked between them, then nodded. "All right. 5-year suspended sentence. He steps out of line once, he goes to the camps. Understood?" Caleb nodded. Abigail felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away. The judge banged his hand on the table. "Case closed." The crowd dispersed slowly, murmuring. The bearded man and his companions left without a word, their faces dark. The sheriff unlocked Caleb's hands and stepped back. Caleb stood in the center of the room, his wrists still bandaged, his face pale. Abigail walked to him. "You're free," she said. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something break in his expression. Not despair, something softer. Relief, maybe, or gratitude. He opened his mouth, then closed it. No words came, but his hand reached out and found hers, and he held it tightly. Outside, the old man was waiting. He handed Caleb a shirt, plain and worn but clean. "You'll start tomorrow," he said. "Dawn, don't be late." Caleb took the shirt and nodded. The old man walked away without ceremony. Abigail and Caleb stood in the square, the sun warm on their faces. The cage sat empty behind them, the door hanging open. "What now?" Caleb asked. Abigail looked at him. She thought about the road stretching in every direction, about the cabin she had burned and the grave she had left behind, about the months of walking away from everything. She thought about the choice she had made to stop, to stay, to stand between him and the rope, and she realized she was tired of running. "Now we stay," she said. Caleb's grip on her hand tightened. He reached up with his other hand and removed the leather cord from around his neck. He held it out to her. "I want you to have this." She shook her head. "That's yours." It was, but I think Ayana would want someone to carry it forward, someone who understands. He pressed it into her palm. "Not to replace what you lost, just to remember that love doesn't end, it changes shape." Abigail looked down at the cord, the bone beads smooth under her thumb, the lock of hair soft as silk. She closed her hand around it and nodded. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out the small ring. Too small for her finger. She held it out to him. "Then you carry this," she said, "for the same reason." He took it carefully, as if it were made of glass. He slipped it onto his smallest finger. It fit, barely. He looked at her, and something unspoken passed between them. Not a vow, not a promise, just an understanding. They would carry each other's grief, and maybe, in time, it would become something lighter. They walked together toward the edge of town, where the road opened into the wide, empty land. They did not go far, just far enough to see the horizon. Then they turned back, toward the square, toward the work waiting, toward the life they would build from fragments. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them looked back. The echo years passed in that town, the way years do, in places where the land changes slowly and people even slower. The buildings weathered, the paint faded. The church steeple leaned a little more to the left, but the town endured, as towns do, holding on to the edge of the desert, like a barnacle to a rock. The cage remained in the square for a time. No one fought to remove it. It sat empty, the door hanging open, rust spreading across the bars like a stain. Children played around it, daring each other to step inside, but none of them stayed long. There was something about it that felt wrong, a memory trapped in iron. One winter, a storm came through and tore the cage loose from its post. The wind carried it to the edge of town and left it half buried in a drift of sand. By spring, it was gone entirely, covered or carried off or simply absorbed back into the land. People stopped talking about it, and eventually, they stopped remembering it had ever been there at all. But they remembered the woman and the man. Abigail Kern stayed in the town. She worked for the old man in the general store, sorting stock, keeping the books, serving customers with a quiet efficiency that earned their respect, if not their warmth. She was not a woman who invited closeness, but she was steady, reliable, the kind of person you could count on when the world proved otherwise. Caleb worked too. He loaded wagons, repaired shelves, hauled supplies from the depot when the train came through. He spoke little, but his hands were skilled, and his work was honest. The old man grew to trust him. So did others, slowly. The suspicion faded, replaced by a grudging acceptance. He was part of the town now. Not welcomed exactly, but tolerated. And in a place like that, tolerance was as close to belonging as most people got. They lived in a small room behind the store. One room, with a stove and 2 narrow beds, and a window that looked out onto the square. It was not much, but it was theirs. In the evenings, after the work was done, they would sit by the window and watch the light fade from the sky. Sometimes they spoke. Most likely they did not. The silence between them had become a language of its own. Abigail wore the leather cord around her neck, the bone bead resting just below her collarbone. She touched it often, without thinking. A small gesture of remembrance. Caleb wore the ring on a chain now, too small for even his smallest finger. It hung beside a second ring, one he had bought with his first month's wages. Simple, unadorned silver. He had offered it to her one evening without ceremony, his hand outstretched, his eyes uncertain. She had taken it, slipped it onto her finger, and that was that. No church, no witnesses. Just the two of them and the promise held in metal. The old man died 3 years after the trial. He went quietly in his sleep, his accounts balanced, his shelves stocked. He left the store to them in a will no one knew he had written. The town lawyer read it aloud in the same saloon where the trial had been held. And the gathered crowd murmured in surprise, but no one contested it. The old man had been clear. The store was theirs. Abigail and Caleb ran it together. She managed the money. He managed the stock. They made a living, not a grand one, but enough. Enough to eat, enough to save a little, enough to help when others could not. A family whose cabin burned, a widow who could not pay for flour, a drifter who needed a meal. They gave quietly, without expectation of return. It was a kind of penance, perhaps, or perhaps it was simply the only way they knew to make the world a little less cruel. People began to tell stories about them. Small stories, the kind that grew in the retelling. How the woman had stood between a man and a moth. How the man had carved a cradle for a neighbor's baby, intricate and beautiful, though he and Abigail had no children of their own. How they had taken in a dog that had been beaten and nursed it back to health. How they had planted a tree in the square, a cottonwood that grew tall and provided shade where the cage had once stood. The stories spread. Travelers passing through would ask about them. The woman and the man who had stayed, who had chosen each other when the world had given them every reason to choose solitude, who had turned grief into something quieter. Not joy, exactly, but peace. The kind of peace that came from knowing you were not alone. Abigail grew older. Her hair went gray at the temples, then silver. Her hands, already scarred, became gnarled with arthritis. But her eyes stayed sharp. Caleb aged too. His shoulders stooped, his hair thinned, but his hands remained steady, and his silence remained a comfort rather than a wound. They did not speak often of the past, but sometimes on cold nights when the wind howled and the stove burned low, Caleb would tell stories of Ayanna, of the way she laughed, of the way she moved through the world with a grace he had never seen before or since. And Abigail would tell stories of her daughter, of the small hand in hers, of the way the child had loved thunderstorms. The telling hurt, but it was a clean hurt, the kind that reminded them they had loved and been loved, and that was enough. One spring, a young woman came to town. She was alone, her dress torn, her face bruised. She carried nothing but a bundle wrapped in cloth. She stood in the square, lost and afraid, and no one approached her, except Abigail. Abigail brought her to the store, fed her, gave her a place to sleep, asked no questions. The woman stayed for a week, then 2, then a month. She began to help in the store. Slowly, she smiled, and when she finally spoke of where she had come from and what she had fled, Abigail listened. And then she said, "You can stay as long as you need." The woman stayed. She became part of the store, part of the town. And when she left, years later, she carried with her the same quiet strength that Abigail had given her. The same understanding that kindness was not a transaction. It was a choice, made again and again in small moments when no one was watching. The desert remembers. The land holds the stories of those who walked it, loved it, bled into it. And long after Abigail and Caleb were gone, the town still told the story of the woman and the man on the cage, of the choice to stop running, of the decision to stay. The cottonwood tree grew tall in the square, its branches wide and sheltering. Children played in its shade. Travelers rested beneath it. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right, the leaves would whisper. Not words exactly, just a sound. A reminder that love does not end, it changes shape. That grief can be carried, that two broken people can hold each other up, that a cage can become a tree, that a town at the edge of nowhere can be a place where someone chooses to stay. The desert remembers, and so do we.